Hello and welcome to C++ Weekly. I'm your host, Jason Turner. I am available for code reviews and on-site training. Now, in this episode, I want to, take a little bit of a diversion from normal C++ talk to talk about what I think might be related to the future of programming education. Now, what I have here is a set of calculators, and I'm going to be straying a little bit from my norm of C++ to talk a little bit about Python. Now, this has two purposes. First of all, getting started with C++ programming can require tooling that is not necessarily readily available on every device straight out of the box. But Python is available on a surprising number of devices. Now, for a little bit of backstory here, I do think it is important for you to be aware of this talk that I gave at C++ on C in 2022, and the title was Making C++ Fun, Safe, and Accessible. And in there, I talk about how do we actually use C++ as a teaching language. Well, in the meantime, this has been, 6 months since I gave this talk approximately, and about a year since I started thinking about this topic. I was made aware of the fact that there is an entire line of calculators that have Python straight out of the box. Which brings us back to this graph. Now, this is tiplanet.org, as you can so helpfully see in the top left. And we're going to be taking a look at some of these options. We've got the TI-82 Advanced Python, the TI-83 Premium CE Python. There's also a TI-84 that has Python. And we have the Casio line here that have Python on them, and NumWorks calculators. Now, varying range of features and prices, but let's go ahead and take a quick look at these stats here. So these Python calculators, the TI-83CE has 256 kilobytes of RAM. The Casio, the black and white Casio, has 512 kilobytes, while the Color Casio has 8 megabytes of RAM, and the NumWorks has 256 kilobytes. You may have noticed at this point that this website, TI Planet, is in fact a French website, but it is absolutely chock full of information on all these calculators. So if you have more interest in them, then I suggest that you go and check this out. But we can see here that we've got CircuitPython 3.2 on the TIs and MicroPython on the Casio and NumWorks. CircuitPython is based on MicroPython, and they are all Python 3 compatible. Well, okay, so we have Python on calculators, and that just got me thinking, with some basic instruction and access to only a calculator, which doesn't require any kind of internet connection or downloads or anything, you can just turn this calculator on, and while you can see here that I actually have a Python program loaded. This particular Python program is one that is a solution for the day one of this year's advent of code. And I did type the whole thing on the calculator, and I know your immediate thoughts are, this does not have a viable keyboard, and the screen is terrible. So let's go ahead and check out real quick this particular calculator on Amazon. So this particular calculator at the moment ships for $52 inside the United States. That is rather cheap. Looking at the calculator itself, it has this rather versatile and flexible case that can go on in either direction, upside down or right side up. It's kind of impossible to get that aspect of it wrong. and it uses AAA batteries. Now, if you are someone in a remote location trying to learn how to program, then using AAA batteries is perhaps not ideal situation for you. But again, let's go ahead and turn this on, and I'm going to exit from here. And notice it asks me if I want to save the file or not each time I exit. And if I click on the menu, you can see that I have Python and I have PRGM. So if I were so inclined, I can still write programs in Casio Basic, or I can write programs in Python. And it gives me the list of Python programs that I have been editing on here. So I'm going to go ahead and hit new. And you can see that the calculator is currently in locked alpha mode. So let's just go ahead and write a quick title. And it will become obvious at some point here that it takes relearning how to type to actually use this. But let's go ahead and do that. And so one of the key things to learn for any of the calculators, I'm going to do a quick demo on 3 different calculators. This is the lowest end one, is that they all have shortcuts for common symbols. So this one has a catalog button, and it can show you all of the various functions that are available. We have symbols that do things like insert parens like that. And we have common operations and common operator shortcuts. Most of these things are available by simply typing out the values, put it in shift lock. So I can do that, and then I can go back and forth between shift lock, shift mode. And this indeed is a bit painful. But if we were to have instead taken advantage of the catalog by saying I want to look at built-in functions, and then I can do something like hit P and get straight to print with the parens. And then a common thing to do now, I get back in alpha mode, it'd be just to type world or whatever have you here. And then we can run this. And again, it asks us if we want to save it. That's an important thing to keep in mind for the future. Oh no, invalid syntax. On which line? Line 1. Invalid syntax on line 1. Exit. And it takes us straight back to this program. And, well, I accidentally used braces instead of parentheses. So let's go ahead and delete those and put in the correct thing. Save the file, run it, and we see hello world printed. We don't have any real debugging capability, but we can scroll back through the full history of this. We can see what version of MicroPython it's running, etc. And having constant access to the shell is actually very interesting. It is a full Python shell. Okay, I'm going to set this one aside and pull up the next most costly version of a calculator that runs Python that I have. And yes, it is worth noting that I did in fact buy these calculators just for this purpose, to make these videos. So we have the Numworks graphing calculator. It is $99. It has a built-in lithium ion battery. So there is no battery compartment to speak of here, but a reset button. It also has a relatively forgiving case that can go on in 4 different orientations with no problem. It has a considerably nicer screen, but you'll note that it is $99.99. We'll also note that I turned it on and it immediately brought me to the Python script that I'd last been working on. Now this is a much higher resolution screen, so we might, for the sake of working on this YouTube video, want to change the font size from small to large. And then if we come back in here to Python, now note again that it did not take us into the last file that we were editing, and it did not take us to the shell. It is different in those ways from the Casio. The Casio really makes Python feel like a first-class citizen. Every time I go back into Python, I am exactly where I last left off. But I can go into the shell from here, and you can see that it automatically imports all of the scripts. So if I were to go back to this page, we can look at any one of these scripts and see if it has this auto import feature set. We can delete and rename it. We cannot copy the script. We cannot do a new save as. The Casio lets us do those features. So we're in auto save mode, which I find somewhat distressing because if I were to do something like this, it doesn't ask me if I want to save. And none of these calculators have an undo button that does what you think it should do. So that is, shall we say, unfortunate. But I can add a new script, and we can go ahead and give this one a similar name, and we have similar deal with shift lock, etc. So this one has a catalog button with a lot of built-in things. So we can go to catalog, look at all of the different imports that we've got, define a new function, etc. For this one to get into alpha lock, I hit the alpha key twice. And you can see that we have a very similar capability. Now, all of these calculators also have graphics capabilities and the ability to draw arbitrary things to the screen. One thing that is of particular note to this calculator, let's go ahead and go back in here, is the ability to do, well, something like, let's do X. Okay, I have X equals 2. Now if I hit this var button, it gives me all of the variables that are currently in scope. That's actually really cool and helps you to write code on this one a bit faster in some ways. But getting used to these different menus is kind of its own thing, like learning about the catalog, the functions, the modules, and various things like that. Okay, so I'm going to set this one aside. I think that did a pretty good job of showing it. Now, this is the most expensive calculator that I have acquired so far. It is currently listed at $108.23. Now, you may note that all of the buttons are in fact in French, and they are in French on the one that I acquired as well. It seems that there's a bit of a crazy history to how Python ended up on these calculators. So I'm going to pull up the stats again for the different Python calculators. Now, going back to TI Planet, you can see that they have done a large exploration of all of these different Python calculators that are available and all kinds of benchmarks on them to some extent. So what we're looking at right now is the TI-83 Premium CE edition. We can see this is one of the actual slower calculators, and interestingly, it's got dual core. It's got the Z80 running at 48 megahertz and the ARM v6 running at 48 megahertz, and I would truly be fascinated to take this apart and understand if they have a shared memory architecture and how this is all clocked together. The Casio that I last showed is equivalent to this one down here. This is an H4 running at 60 megahertz, and it is about twice as slow, 3 times or so, as the TI-83 Premium CE Python edition. And then the numworks that I am demonstrating is this numworks N0110. As far as I can tell, there's no clear way to tell the difference between these when ordering them, but this is the newer model of it, and it is 216 megahertz. And if I were to open this up, it appears that they took a regular TI body, added an extra processor to it, and put this rechargeable battery pack thing over where the AAA batteries would have traditionally resided. All right, so getting to the actual calculator itself, just like the other ones, it has a shell, full Python, and various editor help tools, that kind of thing. I can go in here, and this one is printing Fibonacci numbers, and it's related to a Project Euler example program that we have on here, and it, all feels similar. Now, the key, again, to becoming efficient with any of these calculators for programming on them is to actually learn that there's all of these helper tools that do different things. I can bring up the symbol table, I can bring up the various built-in function things, which gives me the ability to, add a equals equals, like this. Or define a new function with a return statement, for example. And all the calculators have various menus like this. There's also a little bit of a trick, I guess, if you will, that if I go to the list menu, then it brings up all of the things that are related to Python list. And this is somewhat specific to the TI version of the calculator. But then again, it asks me, do you want to quit? Yes or no. It doesn't ask me if I want to save the file I was last working on. And if I go back into the Python app, you can see that it actually has to boot the Python. You can see how slow that was to load. And when I go in to edit something, it doesn't return me back to the thing that I had originally been doing. But it is also worth noting that we have a bunch of built-in things to play with on all of these calculators as well, like some examples that show you how to draw graphs and whatever. So this one, in some ways, is the most capable as far as the shortcuts that exist to help you get code written, but they are harder to find. And it is one of the slower at the highest price. There is a TI-84 Python edition, but it seems to be extremely difficult to come by today. They seem to be having supply issues. So here on Amazon, I searched for a TI-84 Python edition, and do not be fooled. These calculators that say TI-84 plus CE are not the Python edition calculators. Amazon doesn't even necessarily seem to have a second different listing for these. If you go on eBay, you might be able to find one, but at the moment, your best bet is to end up with an 83. Now, there are much higher end ones that have a lot of these features like this, Casio with a touchscreen and a pen interface that also can support Python, and we have the higher end TI as well with a larger screen that can support Python. But that's not the market that I was thinking about. I was thinking about the world where perhaps someone who simply has a calculator for educational purposes, like so many of us in the TI-81 era who would have used TI Basic to do programming, might be able to go into Python app instead of TI Basic or Casio Basic and actually learn a real programming language that's used in industry. And just for the record, if you are purely a C++ programmer and never use Python or any other programming language, it is actually listed as one of my best practices in my book to go out there and try using other programming languages, because there's a lot to learn by learning other programming languages. So I do encourage you to go out there, perhaps learn some Python yourself, and play around with language features that aren't so common in the C++ world. So I hope this was an interesting episode. I expect to play more with this concept in the future, so don't be surprised if you see more from me about Python and Python C++ integration, and perhaps using Python as a gateway for teaching programming, and possibly, theoretically, maybe even some work on helping people who are Python programmers learn C++. I'm not so sure about all of that just yet, but a lot of ideas that have been going around in my head. So again, thanks for watching this episode of C++ Weekly. Be sure to subscribe.